My name is Leah Martinez, and for as long as I can remember, I've known exactly where I stand in my family, background noise in the loud, messy symphony that was my younger brother Ethan's life. I was 8 years old when I realized my accomplishments didn't shine. They merely illuminated the stage for Ethan to stumble across it like the star he believed he was born to be. I remember sitting at the chipped oak kitchen table, proudly holding my first report card with straight A's, the smile on my face brighter than the kitchen light above me, only to have my mother glance at it briefly before turning her full attention to Ethan's crayon drawing of a dragon holding a banana. "That's so creative, baby," she had gushed, clapping as if he'd invented electricity, and in that moment, I learned that excellence without sparkle meant nothing in our house. Our family lived in a modest one-story ranch-style home in Indiana, tucked between rows of gray pavement and chain-link fences, where people talked more about Friday night football than futures. My dad, a mechanic with grease-stained hands and a temper that slept lightly, worked long hours at a local auto shop, while my mother bounced between bookkeeping gigs and church bake sales that made her feel important. Ethan, 2 years younger, had the kind of magnetic charm that drew teachers, neighbors, and even grocery store cashiers into his orbit, and though he broke things often, rules, glass, promises, he always managed to leave with more affection than when he arrived. Meanwhile, I followed the rules, made the honor roll, volunteered at the library, and dreamed of escape routes no one else saw, routes carved from quiet determination and academic scholarships. At 12, I was nominated for a state-level academic award and invited to an evening ceremony downtown. I spent hours choosing a dress, practicing my speech, and saving a seat for my parents, only to wait alone in a folding chair under fluorescent lights that made everything feel just a little more artificial. They never came, my mother later told me, voice trembling with maternal righteousness, that Ethan had been suspended for fighting and needed their support because he's sensitive, Leah, and he was provoked. I nodded, mouth dry, hands stiff around the program I had folded into a square in my lap while pretending I hadn't noticed the empty seats beside me all night. Ethan didn't say sorry. He just smirked like the universe had aligned itself for him once again and went on playing video games while I tried to peel the disappointment from my skin like a scab. As the years blurred together, I learned to keep my joy quiet and my successes smaller, shrinking them until they could hide behind Ethan's weekly dramas, detentions, and disastrous flings with rebellion. At 16, he crashed our dad's rusting blue Buick during an unlicensed joyride with his friends, his blood alcohol level just under the legal limit, barely skirting the line between disaster and juvenile record. The insurance premium spiked, the car was totaled, and Dad yelled for hours, but when it came time to pay the legal fees and hushed the school board from expelling him, they drained my college fund without a word. They didn't tell me directly. I overheard my mother whispering about temporary borrowing, and she'll get scholarships anyway, she always does, as if my savings were community property in Ethan's endless bailouts. When I confronted them, finally letting the bitterness rise like bile in my throat, I asked why they always bent the world to fit Ethan's mistakes while I stood there watching my dreams shrink into IOUs. My mother placed a hand on my arm with the kind of performative grace that could win awards in courtroom dramas, and with a sigh, said the line I would replay for years, "You're strong, Leah, he needs more help." You wouldn't understand. The unfairness didn't just sting, it hollowed something out of me, a tender part that once believed love was measured equally, like cups of sugar in the cookies she made only when Ethan got good grades. After that conversation, I stopped telling them about my life. I applied for colleges on my own, asked my guidance counselor to be my emergency contact, and started hoarding bus schedules the way other girls hoarded makeup samples. The day I received my acceptance letter to a college 3 states away, full scholarship, honors dorm, meal plan included, I smiled so hard my cheeks hurt, even as my mother stared at the packet and said, "So far, Leah? Who's going to help with Ethan when we need you?" I didn't answer her, didn't explain that I had already helped enough, that I had given pieces of my future one Ethan crisis at a time, and that I was done bleeding quietly for a boy who would never bother to notice the tourniquet. The morning I left for college, I packed everything I owned into 2 suitcases and a borrowed duffel bag, while Ethan complained that the internet was too slow and our dad smoked on the porch like he was mourning the loss of something he'd never invested in. Mom hugged me stiffly, said, "Call us when you get there," like I was going to summer camp, not severing the umbilical cord they only noticed when they needed more from me. Ethan didn't even look up from his game console. On the 6-hour bus ride to campus, I didn't cry. I stared out the window at fields and truck stops and broken highway signs, feeling the guilt loosen like a knot unspooling after years of pretending it wasn't choking me. I promised myself 2 things that day: that I would never come back unless I chose to, and that I would never let myself be forgotten again by the people who were supposed to see me first. And in that silence, as the bus hummed forward and the past disappeared into rearview mirrors and mile markers, I began the long, slow process of becoming someone they couldn't ignore, not because I wanted revenge, but because I finally wanted peace. There's something profoundly disorienting about sitting in a dorm room 3 states away from everything you've ever known and realizing, with sudden clarity, that no one is checking to see if you made it there alive. The first night I arrived at college, I sat on the edge of my twin XL mattress, surrounded by the faint smell of industrial cleaner and other people's excitement, and felt an unfamiliar emptiness pressing against my chest. My roommate hadn't arrived yet, and I remember staring at my unpacked suitcase, wondering if independence was supposed to feel like loneliness in better lighting. But I reminded myself, no one had come running after me, no one had begged me to stay, and no one had even noticed when I stopped calling every week. Over the next few months, I learned the delicate art of building a life from scratch, one cafeteria breakfast and part-time library shift at a time, anchoring myself with structure when emotional support was nowhere in sight. I threw myself into my coursework with the kind of quiet hunger that only comes from years of being dismissed, absorbing psychology textbooks and academic theories like lifelines tossed into stormy waters. The first real friend I made was Julia, a transfer student with a nervous laugh and a stubborn streak that reminded me of my own unspoken anger. She offered me coffee and sarcasm during orientation, and somehow it felt like home. It wasn't a sudden transformation. Healing never comes wrapped in epiphanies. But slowly, I began to piece together the version of myself I wanted to become, separate from the roles I had been assigned by a family who saw me as a resource instead of a person. I worked 2 jobs, one at the library shelving books until my arms ached, and another tutoring struggling freshmen in the writing center, where I learned how to explain things gently and listen harder than I spoke. By the time junior year arrived, I had moved into a tiny off-campus apartment with secondhand furniture, a leaky faucet, and more freedom than I had ever tasted in my life. It was during one of those freezing winter nights, while microwaving a sad bowl of instant ramen, that I met Marcus, a grad student in the counseling program who accidentally borrowed my umbrella from the campus cafe. He returned it 2 days later, wrapped in a napkin with a thank you note and a coupon for hot chocolate, saying, "I hope you stayed dry. Sorry I didn't notice until it stopped raining." It was the first time I'd ever been seen without needing to wave my arms or set myself on fire just to be acknowledged, and something inside me softened in response. Marcus was nothing like the loud boys I'd grown up around or the charming manipulators who made apologies with practiced ease. He listened with his whole body, asked follow-up questions, and never once made me feel like I had to shrink to fit beside him. I didn't trust it at first. Part of me kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the inevitable moment where kindness turned into obligation or manipulation. But that moment never came. Instead, he offered stability in small doses, walking me home after evening classes, texting good luck before exams, and remembering details I never expected anyone to hold on to. It was Marcus who gently encouraged me to try therapy, saying that healing didn't mean betraying your family. It just meant choosing not to bleed in the same place forever. The first few sessions were awkward, filled with long silences and vague summaries, but my therapist, a woman named Caroline with warm eyes and sharp intuition, slowly guided me through the tangled roots of my childhood. I talked about Ethan for the first time without minimizing his actions or defending my parents, and as the words tumbled out, I realized how often I had internalized blame for their choices and called it maturity. By the time I graduated, I had learned how to say no without apologizing, how to sit with discomfort without spiraling, and how to recognize the difference between love and dependency. I got a job offer from a mid-sized publishing firm in Chicago, steady pay, health insurance, and enough breathing room to live without counting every penny twice, and I accepted it without telling my parents until I had already signed the lease. The first text I received from home in almost a year came from Ethan, 2 months after I settled into my new studio apartment, and it opened with 4 words that made my stomach twist. "Hey sis, need help?" He didn't ask how I was or what I'd been up to, just launched into a story about getting laid off from a warehouse job and needing a few $100s to get back on his feet. There was no mention of repaying me, no hint of accountability, just the usual vague references to bad luck, unfair managers, and how "Mom said you'd understand because you're always good at money stuff." I stared at the message for a full hour before responding with a gentle but firm refusal, explaining that I couldn't send money but wished him luck and hoped he found support elsewhere. The next few messages escalated quickly. He accused me of being heartless, of forgetting where I came from, of letting money turn me cold and selfish. He said things like, "You think you're better than us now," and "You owe us, Leah, we gave you everything," as if years of silence and sacrifice could be rewritten with a few guilt-drenched texts. I didn't respond, and when I finally blocked his number, I felt both relief and a dull ache that pulsed like a phantom limb. I had spent so long trying to love him through his damage that I didn't know what to do with the space his absence left behind. 3 days later, my mother called, her voice brittle with performative concern, asking if I'd really turned my back on Ethan during a hard time for our family. She didn't ask how I was, didn't mention my new job or the life I was building, only spoke of Ethan's feelings, Ethan's struggles, Ethan's hurt, as if my entire identity still existed as a cushion for his inevitable fall. When I said calmly that I couldn't support him financially and that I didn't feel responsible for the choices he continued to make, she paused, then said, "I raised you to be better than this, Leah, you used to care." I ended the call with a simple goodbye and cried afterward, not because I regretted the boundary, but because a small, frightened part of me still wanted her to be proud of me. Thanksgiving arrived with the heavy, obligatory pressure that only holidays can summon, and after much deliberation and therapy, I decided to go home for the first time in 5 years. I told myself it was for closure, to test my growth, to see if peace could exist where pain had once lived, but part of me still hoped for something redemptive. The moment I walked through the front door, carrying a store-bought pecan pie and a polite smile, I knew nothing had changed except me. My mother offered a stiff hug and commented that I looked very professional, which I knew was code for distant, pretentious, or maybe just not broken enough for her liking. Ethan barely acknowledged me, retreating to the basement with a beer and a friend I didn't recognize, and my father muttered something about traffic before settling into his recliner like a man preparing for war by omission. Dinner was a tense performance, each dish placed like a peace offering, each comment laced with subtle criticism masquerading as concern. "So what exactly do you do in publishing?" my mother asked, smiling tightly as she passed the mashed potatoes. "I imagine it must be creative, not very stable though." When I explained my position and salary, she blinked and said, "Must be nice not having real problems," as if my stability was a character flaw instead of a hard-earned victory. The room fell silent, and I excused myself to the bathroom, locking the door and leaning against the sink as tears burned at the corners of my eyes. I didn't cry because I was weak. I cried because I had spent so long wishing they could see me clearly, only to realize they were committed to their own version of the story. I left before dessert, driving away in the cold twilight, the pies still untouched in the back seat and my heart heavier than I'd anticipated. But as I sat in the parking lot of a gas station 30 miles outside of town, crying into my steering wheel with the engine still running, I felt something shift. The pain was still there, raw and bitter, but underneath it was something steadier, a quiet certainty that I had made the right decision, even if it broke something sacred in the process. For the first time in my life, I wasn't walking away because I was hurt or angry. I was walking away because I deserved peace, and I was finally willing to choose it. It was a rainy Tuesday morning when I first saw Ethan's name scrolling across the local news ticker while I stood in my kitchen, waiting for the kettle to whistle and scrolling through notifications without much interest. At first, I didn't register the name. I thought it must be someone else, some other Ethan Martinez caught in whatever scandal was flashing across the screen under dramatic bold headlines and blurry mugshots. But then the station cut to a close-up, his smirk unchanged, that careless, too proud expression I hadn't seen in person in almost 2 years, frozen now beneath the words, identity theft and felony fraud. I dropped my phone onto the countertop with a loud clatter. and the kettle screamed as if it sensed the panic flooding through my limbs. The news anchor's voice was eerily calm as she explained the unfolding investigation. A young man accused of opening over a dozen fraudulent credit lines using stolen identities from his employer's customer database, with charges spanning several counties. She mentioned the name of the company, Midwest Storage Solutions, along with the dates he'd worked there, and I felt a sickening lurch in my stomach as I remembered a message I'd once ignored in passing. A year earlier, he had texted me something vague about doing customer service for a logistics gig, asking if I knew anything about data systems. Just curious, he'd said, nothing serious, just wondering how companies stored personal info. I had brushed it off at the time, chalking it up to Ethan's usual combination of laziness and last-minute desperation, never imagining he'd go as far as stealing entire identities and ruining strangers' lives for cash. That same afternoon, I got a voicemail from a blocked number, the woman on the other end speaking calmly but clearly. She was a federal investigator with the Financial Crimes Division, and my name had come up in relation to an open fraud case. For several seconds after listening, I just stood there motionless, staring out my apartment window as if the city skyline could explain why my past kept finding new ways to collapse into my present. When I finally called her back, my voice trembled with a mix of fear and numbness, and I listened as she explained that while reviewing activity linked to Ethan's accounts, they discovered a failed attempt to use my name and social security number. Apparently, the card application had been flagged before any charges were made, likely due to mismatched addresses or suspicious input timing. But the attempt was documented, and my name was now part of the evidence. I sat in stunned silence as she asked if I had ever given Ethan access to my personal information, things like financial records, tax documents, or identification numbers, and I felt something inside me fracture when I realized the answer was yes. Years ago, when applying for FAFSA during college, I had stored scanned versions of my documents on a shared family drive, the same cloud folder my father used for tax files and my mother used for recipe PDFs. I told her everything I could remember, my voice shaking, and when she thanked me for my cooperation, I felt the absurd urge to apologize. For what? I wasn't sure, maybe for being predictable enough to trust the people who raised me. After the call ended, I sat alone at my dining table with my head in my hands, feeling an overwhelming wave of exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with grief. It wasn't the fraud that hurt the most. It was the audacity, the betrayal, the bitter confirmation that even after years of silence, Ethan still saw me as nothing more than a tool he could use when life cornered him. For 2 days, I barely slept, alternating between moments of furious pacing and hours of stunned stillness, as every news update dragged another piece of my family's shame into the light. I didn't reach out to my parents, didn't post about it on social media, didn't answer the well-meaning messages from old classmates who suddenly remembered my name once it was attached to a scandal. Then, on the third night, just after 9 p.m., I heard a knock at my apartment door, a sharp, impatient rhythm that triggered something primal in me, something that whispered, "Don't open it." When I finally did, I saw both of them standing there, my mother holding her coat closed against the wind, my father looking old in a way I hadn't seen before, like the weight of their delusions had finally settled on his spine. I didn't invite them in, I just stepped aside quietly, letting them walk into the home they had never once visited before this crisis made me useful again. My mother spoke first, launching into a rehearsed monologue about misunderstanding, the cruelty of the justice system, and how the media never tells the full story, never mentioning the victims, never acknowledging the facts. They weren't there because they regretted enabling Ethan. They were there because their golden child had finally run out of luck, and now they were scrambling to rewrite the narrative before the consequences solidified. "We need your help," my mother said, her voice trembling as she sat stiffly on the couch. "Just a character letter, Leah, something to show the court that he's not a monster. And if you could lend something toward the legal fund," my father added, his eyes avoiding mine, "we'd repay you, of course. This is just temporary, just until we get things sorted." I stared at them for a long time before answering, letting the silence fill the space where years of resentment had quietly multiplied until it choked everything else out. "You want me to write a letter defending someone who tried to steal my identity?" I asked, my voice calm but shaking slightly at the edges. My mother's face contorted slightly. She hadn't expected directness, hadn't expected resistance, Not after all those years of me keeping the peace like a well-trained diplomat in a war zone I never agreed to fight in. He's your brother, she said, almost whispering, as if that absolved everything. Family means something, Leah. That was when something inside me snapped. Not violently, not loudly, but with the quiet, final certainty of a lock turning for the last time. No, I said, standing slowly, family should mean something. But you picked him over me for 30 years, and look where it got him. They didn't respond right away, but my mother's expression shifted into something I recognized. Wounded pride disguised as disappointment, the same look she gave me when I won awards that didn't benefit Ethan. You think you're better than us now, she said softly, but you're just selfish. You abandoned him. You abandoned all of us. I looked her in the eye and felt nothing, not anger, not guilt, just a cold, distant clarity that felt both tragic and liberating. You abandoned me first, I replied, my voice steady now, and you did it every single time you told me I was strong so you didn't have to protect me. They left shortly after that, the door clicking closed behind them with the finality of a chapter ending, and I stood alone in the quiet, surrounded by the echoes of a conversation I had rehearsed in my head for years. That night, I couldn't sleep, so I did what I always do when pain becomes too heavy for one heart to carry. I opened my laptop and typed. I didn't post under my real name, didn't include identifying details, but I went to a corner of the internet where truth doesn't need a face to be heard. Reddit's/true off my chest. I wrote about growing up invisible in a home that only made noise when Ethan was in trouble, about the award ceremony they missed, the college fund they drained, and the soft apologies they never gave. I wrote about the phone calls, the manipulative texts, the final betrayal of having my name tangled in a list of victims for a crime I hadn't even known was unfolding. I ended the post with the line, sometimes, being the strong one doesn't mean staying. It means leaving and never looking back, even when the house is on fire. The post went viral overnight. Strangers from every corner of the globe flooded the comments with validation, empathy, and heartbreaking parallels. People who had lived through their own versions of being the forgotten sibling, the invisible child, the second priority. For the first time in my life, I was heard by people who didn't need me to be silent to love me, who didn't require my pain to make someone else feel whole. It didn't erase the damage, didn't undo the years I'd spent trying to earn a place in a story that was never written for me, but it reminded me that I wasn't alone, and I wasn't wrong. And that, in its own quiet way, was enough to keep going. When the sentencing came through, the official statement from the court clerk landed in my inbox like a stone dropped in still water, sudden, heavy, and strangely quiet for something that had been building like a storm for years. Ethan was given 6.5 years in federal prison, with eligibility for parole after 4, pending behavior evaluations and participation in mandated restitution programs for his victims, most of whom would never recover what he stole. I read the PDF slowly, letting each word settle into the crevices where disbelief had once lived, and found that I didn't feel victorious, relieved, or even vindicated. I just felt tired in a way that therapy hadn't quite reached yet. My parents didn't contact me directly after the sentencing, but I heard through a mutual family acquaintance that they had quietly sold the house and moved 3 hours south, to be closer to Ethan's correctional facility. It didn't surprise me that they rearranged their lives around him again. What surprised me was how little it hurt this time, as if the wound had finally scarred over into something solid. By then, I had been married for almost 2 years to Marcus, the same patient, emotionally fluent man who had once returned my umbrella and offered a coupon for cocoa like it was an apology for the whole world's coldness. Our wedding had been small, just 20 people in a garden behind a local museum, with fairy lights, handwritten vows, and a silence that didn't ache, only comforted. I hadn't invited my parents. At the time, the decision had gutted me, made me question whether I was erasing my history or simply refusing to let it define my future. But in hindsight, it was one of the clearest boundaries I had ever held. Marcus understood without question, and when we danced barefoot in the dewy grass to a quiet song only we recognized, I felt something inside me shift, a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying finally loosening from my ribs. We moved into a quiet neighborhood outside Chicago, with creaky wooden floors, a tiny fenced yard, and windows that caught the golden hour just right, enough to make the evenings glow like warm memory. I kept going to therapy, even when life seemed peaceful on the surface, because I knew that healing wasn't a destination. It was a practice, a commitment to choosing peace every day, even when old grief knocked quietly at the door. When our daughter was born on a foggy April morning, the hospital lights buzzed overhead while I held her against my chest, and I made a silent promise to the universe that I would never let her feel the loneliness I had carried like a second skin. Her name was Ava, a name that felt soft and strong at once, and when she opened her tiny eyes for the first time, I swear it felt like the whole world paused to inhale. Becoming a mother cracked me open in ways I hadn't expected. It didn't make me forget the past, but it made me more determined than ever to build something different in its place. I remember standing at the kitchen sink one evening while Ava napped in her carrier, and thinking about how many hours my mother must have spent doing the same thing, lost in thoughts she never voiced. That night, after putting Ava to bed, I sat down with a notebook and wrote a letter to my parents, not with the intention of sending it, but because some words need to be said even if no one hears them. I wrote that I forgave them, not for their sake, but for mine, because carrying their mistakes was no longer my inheritance or my duty. I wrote about the quiet ache of being unseen, about the nights I spent doubting my worth, about the anger I had swallowed for so long it began to feel like hunger. I ended the letter with a simple truth. I no longer needed their recognition to feel whole. I had given myself what they never could. Folding the pages, I tucked them into a box on my closet shelf, beside hospital bracelets and Ava's first sonogram, not as a monument to pain, but as a record of survival. Sometime later, I joined a local support group for adult children of narcissistic or enmeshed families, not because I needed sympathy, but because I needed to know I wasn't the only one trying to love through ruin. The first meeting felt like stepping into a mirror, listening to strangers describe experiences that echoed my own so precisely. I found myself holding my breath just to keep from unraveling. There were teachers, therapists, baristas, nurses, all of us carrying different versions of the same wound, all of us learning, slowly, that survival didn't mean silence. One night, after a particularly raw session where I spoke about the sentencing, a woman named Dana reached over and squeezed my hand, whispering, "You did the bravest thing, you broke the pattern." That sentence stayed with me for weeks. It echoed again months later, when I received an unexpected Facebook message from my cousin Sophia, the same cousin who once told me Ethan was just a phase, who used to post family group photos I was conspicuously cropped out of. She wrote, "Leah, I know this is probably strange after everything, but I just wanted to say, you were right. We all saw it. We were just too afraid to say anything. I'm sorry." I stared at the message for several minutes, letting her words wash over the places that still ached for someone, anyone, to acknowledge the reality I'd lived. I didn't reply right away, not because I didn't believe her, but because I needed time to decide whether forgiveness meant opening the door, or simply leaving the lock unlatched. A few weeks after that message, I received a letter, an actual, handwritten letter, from Ethan himself, forwarded through a third-party legal platform designated for inmate communications. The return address was scrawled in his familiar, looping handwriting, and the inside held a carefully worded apology that managed to say everything except the part one had always needed most. "I did this to myself." He asked if I would consider visiting, said he wanted to talk, to clear the air, before parole hearings began, and for a moment, I almost tore the letter up without reading further. But something inside me, the part that still believed in closure, in choosing peace over revenge, told me to wait, to think, to decide on my own terms instead of reacting out of old wounds. 3 weeks later, I found myself walking through the heavy, sterile corridors of the correctional facility, my palms sweating despite the chill in the air. Ava safe at home with Marcus. The visitation room was colder than I'd expected, with bolted chairs and fluorescent lighting that made everything feel more fragile than it should. Ethan walked in wearing beige and shackles, and for the first time in my life, I saw him not as my brother, not even as my past, but simply as a man who had burned every bridge and now stood in the ashes, unsure which direction to walk. He smiled like he used to when we were kids, crooked, careless, a little too confident, and when he said, "Thanks for coming," I didn't smile back. He talked for a while, about therapy in prison, about regret, about how he'd been trying to figure stuff out, and how it wasn't really about you, Leah, it was just survival. When he finally said, "I'm sorry," It landed with the softness of a paper airplane in a hurricane. Sincere, perhaps, but too late and too fragile to hold any real weight. I nodded once and replied, "I hope you find what you're looking for. But I'm done carrying your weight." He didn't argue. We sat in silence for a few moments after that, and then I stood, walked to the exit, and didn't look back. The drive home felt lighter than I had expected, not because the visit healed anything, but because I had finally put down the burden of hoping it ever could. 2 months later, I sat at a park near our home, watching Ava toddle across the playground in her sun hat, her giggles bubbling like music through the warm spring air. Marcus sat beside me on the bench, his hand resting over mine, our picnic bag half unpacked, juice boxes poking out like lazy smiles. I was mid-laugh at something Ava did, something clumsy and perfect, when my phone buzzed on the blanket beside me, screen lit with a number I hadn't seen in over a year. It was my mother. For a moment, the world held still, the sun still shining, the grass still green, Ava still running. But in my chest, something very old and very tired stirred. I didn't answer. I watched it ring until the screen went dark, then opened my settings and silenced the number for good, not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of love for the life I had finally chosen. And as Ava called out, "Mommy, watch this," I turned toward her with my whole heart, knowing that this moment of freedom, of laughter, of sunlight, was the only legacy I ever wanted to pass down.